Retired police detective Frank thought his pension checks were being delayed by bureaucratic problems. He had no idea his nephew, who handled his finances, had been stealing his retirement money for 2 years while Frank battled cancer. But what David didn't know was that Frank's investigative instincts were sharper than ever, and he'd been building a case. Frank Morrison had served the city for 32 years, working everything from beat cop to homicide detective. He'd seen every type of criminal, solved cases that stumped younger officers, and earned respect from both colleagues and criminals. But cancer had changed everything. The diagnosis came 6 months after Frank's retirement party. Stage 3 lung cancer, aggressive treatment required. Frank's world became doctor visits, chemotherapy sessions, and managing medications that made simple tasks feel impossible. When his nephew David offered to help with finances and paperwork, it seemed like a blessing. David had always been Frank's favorite. His sister's boy, smart and ambitious, working as an accountant downtown. Frank had helped pay for David's college, celebrated his graduation, and trusted him completely. When David suggested taking over Frank's banking and bill paying to reduce stress during treatment, Frank gratefully handed over the responsibility. That's when the theft began, hidden behind cancer treatments and family concern. But Frank Morrison hadn't spent 3 decades catching liars and thieves just to become an easy mark in his own family. David started small, testing how much he could take without Frank noticing. $100 here, $200 there, always with plausible excuses about medical copays or utility increases. Frank was too sick from chemotherapy to question the details, spending his days managing nausea and fatigue while trusting his nephew to handle the financial complexities of his medical treatment. The theft began just 2 weeks after David gained access to Frank's accounts. Frank had given David power of attorney during a particularly bad week of treatment when the paperwork felt overwhelming. David assured his uncle it was temporary, just until Frank felt strong enough to manage things himself. Frank signed the documents without reading the fine print, grateful to have family support during his darkest moments. But David's gambling addiction made small amounts impossible to sustain. He had been hiding his problem for over 3 years, losing money at underground poker games in the warehouse district and online sports betting sites that operated outside state regulations. What had started as casual $20 bets on football games had escalated into $1,000 losses on basketball games he knew nothing about. David's accounting job provided steady income, but it wasn't enough to cover both his living expenses and his gambling debts. He had already maxed out his credit cards, borrowed money from friends with increasingly creative excuses, and taken advances on his salary. Frank's pension checks and retirement savings were supposed to be temporary relief until David could get back on his feet and maybe enter a treatment program. Instead, Frank's money became David's primary source of funding for increasingly desperate gambling attempts to win back his losses. Every month, David told himself he would replace the money after one good win. Every month, he lost more than he had taken, creating an impossible cycle that trapped him deeper in theft and deception. Within 3 months, David was taking nearly $1,000 each month from Frank's accounts. He developed an elaborate system of fake documentation to cover his tracks. He created false medical bills on his computer, inflating actual co-payments and inventing treatment costs that sounded plausible to someone who didn't understand the medical system. David forged utility statements showing higher rates for Frank's house, claiming that medical equipment was increasing electricity costs. He invented home maintenance emergencies that required immediate payment. A furnace repair here, a plumbing problem there, always with amounts that seemed reasonable but were completely fabricated. The most sophisticated part of David's scheme involved the bank statements. Each month, he intercepted Frank's mail and created new statements on his computer that showed the correct starting balance, but hid his withdrawals behind legitimate-looking medical expenses and cost-of-living adjustments. Frank never saw his real bank statements, only David's carefully crafted forgeries. When Frank asked about his savings account balance during one of his better days, David would show him the fake statements and explain how medical inflation was eating through retirement funds faster than anyone expected. He convinced Frank that this was normal for cancer patients, that most people underestimated the true cost of treatment. The cancer treatment was actually working better than expected, but Frank was getting weaker from financial stress he didn't even know he was experiencing. David convinced him that the medical bills were so overwhelming that they might need to consider selling Frank's house, the house Frank had shared with his late wife for 30 years, to cover future treatment costs and maintain his quality of life. Frank trusted David completely because family loyalty was the foundation of his worldview. After his wife Marie died 5 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, David had stepped up in ways that touched Frank's heart. David visited every Sunday for dinner, helped with grocery shopping when Frank's arthritis flared up, and handled small repairs around the house without being asked. Frank had no children of his own, having devoted his career to law enforcement instead of starting a family. David had become like the son he never had, calling to check on Frank's health, remembering important dates like Marie's birthday, and showing genuine concern for Frank's well-being during the cancer treatment. Frank never imagined that the young man he had helped raise, the nephew he had put through college and mentored through early career struggles, was systematically stealing his financial security while pretending to protect it. The betrayal was so far outside Frank's understanding of David's character that it never occurred to him to verify the financial information he was being given. But David's gambling addiction continued escalating beyond his ability to manage through steady theft. The underground poker games were run by people who didn't accept excuses for unpaid debts. David owed money to loan sharks who charged interest rates that made his debt spiral out of control, even when he wasn't actively gambling. After a particularly devastating losing streak at the warehouse poker game, where David lost $8,000 in a single night trying to win back previous losses, he found himself facing threats from people who had already broken fingers for smaller debts. David needed $15,000 within 72 hours to avoid serious physical consequences. In desperation, David decided to take one large withdrawal from Frank's emergency savings account, figuring he could replace it before Frank noticed or needed the money. He told himself this would be the last theft, that he would use whatever he won to pay back everything he had stolen and get his life back on track. Frank had established this emergency account during his police career, slowly building it over decades as insurance against unexpected medical expenses or home repairs. It contained nearly $40,000, money Frank had never mentioned to anyone because he believed in keeping some resources completely private and secure. What David didn't know was that Frank had set up automatic email alerts on that specific account years ago, a precautionary habit from his detective days of always having backup security measures for important assets. Frank believed in multiple layers of protection for anything valuable, whether it was evidence in a case or money in a bank account. When the alert notification came through to Frank's personal email at 3 a.m, showing a $15,000 withdrawal from his emergency savings, the old detective's instincts kicked in immediately, cutting through the fog of medication and illness like a sharp blade through cloth. Frank stared at the email alert on his phone screen, his mind immediately shifting from cancer patient to seasoned detective. $15,000 withdrawn at 11:47 p.m. from an account that only he and David knew existed. The timestamp was what caught Frank's attention first. David had access to the account through the power of attorney. But why would he need that much money in the middle of the night on a Tuesday? Frank's detective instincts had been honed by 32 years of police work, starting as a beat cop in the roughest neighborhoods and working his way up through narcotics, robbery, and finally homicide. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot inconsistencies and lies, skills that had made him one of the department's most successful investigators. Cancer might have weakened his body, but it hadn't touched his analytical mind. His first instinct was to assume there had been an emergency he wasn't aware of. Maybe David had been in a car accident and needed immediate medical care that insurance wouldn't cover. Maybe there was a family crisis Frank had missed while sleeping off his latest chemotherapy session, which had left him unconscious for nearly 14 hours. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the timing, the amount, and the secrecy. Despite the bone-deep fatigue that made even standing up feel like a monumental effort, Frank forced himself out of bed and walked to his home office. This was the same room where he had reviewed case files for 3 decades, surrounded by commendations, photos with fellow officers, and the methodical filing system that had helped him solve over 200 cases during his career. His detective notebooks were still organized in filing cabinets according to his own system, a method so precise that he could locate any piece of information within minutes. His instincts for investigation were as sharp as ever, despite his physical weakness, muscle memory from decades of analyzing evidence and connecting seemingly unrelated facts. Frank called the bank's 24-hour customer service line using the special account number he had memorized years ago when he first established the emergency fund. The automated system confirmed the withdrawal, $15,000, taken from an ATM downtown at exactly 11:47 p.m. But when Frank pressed for more details, the location made his blood run cold. The ATM was on Industrial Boulevard, 3 blocks from the warehouse district, an area Frank knew intimately from his years in narcotics and vice enforcement. This was where illegal gambling operations, loan sharks, and off-the-books businesses operated in buildings that looked abandoned but hummed with activity after midnight. No legitimate person needed $15,000 in cash from that neighborhood at that hour. Frank had arrested enough gambling addicts during his career to recognize the patterns immediately. Desperate people taking large amounts of cash in the middle of the night, always from locations near underground games where legitimate businesses didn't operate after dark. The withdrawal wasn't random. It was the behavior of someone feeding an addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. That realization made Frank's stomach turn, with a combination of betrayal and recognition. His nephew, who handled all his finances with apparent care and concern, had withdrawn a massive amount of money at midnight from the heart of the city's illegal gambling district. The pieces were starting to form a picture Frank desperately didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Frank hung up the phone and sat in his office chair, the same worn leather chair where he had solved dozens of cases by methodically connecting facts until the truth became undeniable. He pulled out a yellow legal pad, the same type he had used for case notes throughout his career, and began documenting everything he knew with the systematic approach that had made him successful as a detective. But Detective Frank Morrison had built his reputation on never avoiding ugly truths, even when they involved people he cared about, especially when they involved people he cared about. Some of his most difficult cases had required investigating fellow officers, city officials, and even his own partner during a corruption scandal that had nearly ended his career. Frank spent the rest of the night going through every piece of financial paperwork David had given him over the past 8 months, spreading documents across his desk like evidence in a complex fraud case. He pulled out his magnifying glass, a tool he had used to examine evidence for 30 years, and studied the bank statements David had provided line by line, looking for the subtle inconsistencies that always revealed forgeries. The fraudulent documents were sophisticated but not perfect. David had used high-quality paper and professional formatting software that replicated the bank's official layout with impressive accuracy. But Frank's trained eye spotted inconsistencies that only someone with extensive experience in document analysis would notice. The font sizes were slightly inconsistent between different sections of the statements, suggesting computer manipulation rather than official bank printing. More importantly, Frank noticed that none of the statements had the watermark security features that his bank had started using 2 years earlier to prevent fraud, a detail David wouldn't have known about unless he was a professional counterfeiter. Frank realized with growing horror that he hadn't seen an actual bank statement in over 6 months. David had convinced him that electronic statements were easier to manage during cancer treatment, that sorting through physical mail was just one more stressful task Frank didn't need to worry about, while focusing on his health and recovery. Every statement Frank had seen was actually a printout David had brought to his house during weekly visits, supposedly downloaded from the bank's website, but actually created on David's home computer using accounting software and stolen bank letterhead. David had been intercepting Frank's real mail and replacing it with fabricated financial information designed to hide systematic theft. By dawn, Frank had identified at least 15 instances of suspicious withdrawals over the past 8 months. The amounts ranged from $200 to $1,500, all carefully explained by David as medical co-payments, inflated utility bills, or home maintenance emergencies that Frank was too sick to verify personally. Frank calculated that approximately $23,000 had been taken from his accounts beyond legitimate medical expenses. The theft had been gradual and systematic, designed to avoid detection by someone who was weakened by illness and dependent on family support to manage daily responsibilities. The realization hit Frank like a physical blow to his already weakened body. His nephew, the young man he had loved like the son he never had been systematically stealing his retirement money while pretending to protect it from medical bankruptcy. David had manipulated Frank's illness, grief, and family loyalty, using trust as a weapon against someone who was already fighting for his life. Frank's first emotion was heartbreak so profound it made his chest ache worse than any chemotherapy side effect. He thought about all the times David had sat in this same office, pretending to review legitimate expenses, while actually calculating how much he could steal without detection. He remembered David's concerned expressions during medical appointments, his offers to help with paperwork, his reassurances that Frank's finances were being handled properly. Then came the anger that had made Frank one of the most effective detectives in the department's history. Cold, calculating fury that transformed his mind into a precision instrument focused entirely on justice. This wasn't just theft. This was elder abuse, medical fraud, and family betrayal combined into a crime that violated everything Frank believed about loyalty and trust. Frank Morrison had spent 3 decades investigating criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. He had traced complex financial fraud schemes, built prosecutable cases from circumstantial evidence, and sent dozens of white-collar thieves to prison by carefully documenting their crimes until conviction was inevitable and appeals were impossible. Now he was going to use those same investigative skills against his own nephew, with the methodical precision of someone who had never lost a case he was determined to win. Frank's investigation strategy was methodical and comprehensive, drawing on techniques he had perfected during the most complex financial crime cases of his career. First, he needed to secure physical evidence without alerting David that his theft had been discovered. Any sign that Frank was suspicious would cause David to destroy evidence and possibly disappear entirely. Frank called his bank from a secure phone line and requested physical copies of all account statements for the past 18 months to be mailed to a P.O. box he rented under his middle name at a location David had never visited. He explained to the bank representative that he was conducting a comprehensive personal financial audit and needed official documentation with security features that couldn't be forged. The bank representative, recognizing Frank's name from his years of police work, expedited the request and included detailed transaction histories that showed not just withdrawals, but the specific ATM locations and times for each theft. This documentation would provide irrefutable evidence of David's movements and spending patterns. Next, Frank began surveillance on David's activities using techniques he had perfected during undercover narcotics operations and organized crime investigations. Despite his physical weakness from cancer treatment, Frank started following David's movements on evenings and weekends, documenting his nephew's visits to locations that had nothing to do with legitimate accounting work or family obligations. Frank's surveillance equipment came from contacts he had maintained in the police department, retired officers who now worked private security and were willing to loan gear to their former colleague. Frank set up a rotation schedule that allowed him to monitor David's activities without exhausting himself or missing chemotherapy appointments. The surveillance revealed that David was gambling 3 to 4 nights per week at illegal poker games, underground sports betting operations, and high-stakes card games in warehouse locations that the police department had identified but never successfully prosecuted due to lack of evidence and political protection. Using military-grade binoculars from his car, Frank photographed David entering buildings that he recognized from organized crime investigations. Frank had worked cases in these same warehouses during his career, but had never been able to build prosecutable cases against the operators because witnesses refused to cooperate and evidence was always destroyed before raids could be executed. Frank's photos showed David's car parked outside gambling locations on 12 different occasions over a 3-week period, with timestamps that corresponded exactly to large withdrawals from Frank's accounts. The pattern was so clear that any prosecutor would be able to demonstrate David's gambling addiction and its direct connection to the theft of his uncle's money. The most damaging evidence came from Frank's decision to install professional surveillance equipment in his own home, the same type of recording devices he had used during internal affairs investigations of corrupt officers. Frank purchased the equipment using his emergency credit card, setting up a comprehensive system that would capture audio and video whenever someone entered his office or handled financial documents. The recording equipment was completely legal since it was Frank's own home, and the evidence would be admissible in court because David had no expectation of privacy while handling someone else's financial information. Frank positioned the devices to capture David's activities during his weekly visits, when he supposedly reviewed Frank's medical bills and managed legitimate expenses. Within 2 weeks, Frank had recorded David making phone calls to gambling associates, discussing debts that totaled over $40,000 and payment schedules that explained his increasingly desperate thefts. David used Frank's house phone for these conversations when he thought his uncle was sleeping, apparently believing that a cancer patient posed no threat to his criminal activities. David's recorded conversations revealed not just his gambling addiction, but his detailed knowledge of illegal gambling operations, loan shark payment structures, and money laundering techniques that suggested he had been involved in criminal activity far beyond simple theft. Frank realized that his nephew had become deeply embedded in organized crime networks that controlled illegal gambling in the city. But the most chilling recording captured David talking to another gambler about Frank's cancer prognosis, speculating about how long the old man would live and whether the stealing could continue long enough to pay off David's debts before Frank died, or recovered enough to discover the theft. David discussed his uncle's deteriorating health as if it were a business opportunity with a limited but profitable time frame. He calculated Frank's life expectancy based on cancer survival statistics and estimated how much money he could steal before Frank either died or became healthy enough to resume managing his own finances. Frank listened to that recording multiple times, his hands shaking with rage and betrayal that went beyond anything he had experienced during 30 years of investigating the worst crimes humans could commit against each other. David wasn't just stealing money. He was hoping Frank's cancer would kill him before the theft was discovered, treating his uncle's death as the ideal solution to his criminal activities. That's when Frank Morrison stopped thinking like a victim of family betrayal and started planning like a detective with a personal score to settle and unlimited time to ensure that justice was not just served, but delivered with the precision of someone who had never lost a case when the evidence was overwhelming and the criminal had made the mistake of underestimating their opponent. Frank's revenge strategy was built on 32 years of police experience and a detective's understanding of how to destroy someone methodically and legally. He wasn't interested in simple confrontation or family drama. He wanted to ensure David faced every possible consequence for his crimes while learning exactly what it felt like to be betrayed by someone he trusted completely. Frank's first move was to secure his remaining assets without alerting David to his discovery. Using contacts in the banking industry from his police work, Frank quietly opened new accounts at a different bank under enhanced security protocols. He transferred his legitimate money to accounts David couldn't access, leaving just enough in the compromised accounts to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. But Frank's masterstroke was creating fake financial records that would lead David deeper into criminal activity while building an unshakable legal case against him. Frank used his knowledge of forgery techniques, learned from investigating document fraud cases, to create bank statements showing a much larger emergency fund than actually existed. Frank's fabricated statements indicated that his emergency savings contained over $80,000 instead of the actual $25,000 remaining after David's thefts. Frank made sure David would discover these fake statements during his next weekly visit, planted in locations where David always snooped for financial information. The psychological impact was immediate. David saw the fake statements and realized he had been stealing from what appeared to be a much larger fortune than he had imagined. Frank watched through hidden cameras as David's eyes widened with a mixture of greed and panic. Greed at the potential for larger thefts, panic at the realization that his uncle was wealthier than expected and might notice missing money more easily. Frank's plan was to let David steal money that didn't actually exist, creating obvious discrepancies that would be impossible to explain when Frank eventually confronted him with evidence. But first, Frank wanted to ensure David's gambling addiction led him deeper into legal trouble that would result in serious criminal charges. Frank began feeding David false information about his medical prognosis during casual conversations, claiming that his cancer treatment was going better than expected and that he might live much longer than initially projected. Frank watched David's expression carefully during these conversations, documenting his nephew's obvious disappointment at news that should have made any loving family member celebrate. The fake medical updates served a strategic purpose. They made David more desperate to steal larger amounts quickly before Frank recovered enough to resume managing his own finances. Frank was essentially baiting David into committing more serious crimes that would result in longer prison sentences. Frank's surveillance revealed that David was now visiting gambling locations almost every night, desperately trying to win enough money to pay off loan sharks who were becoming increasingly threatening. Frank recorded phone conversations where David was given ultimatums about payment deadlines and heard explicit threats about violence if debts weren't settled within days. That's when Frank implemented the most elaborate part of his revenge plan. Using his connections with active police officers, Frank arranged for the gambling locations David frequented to be targeted in coordinated raids that would happen on nights when David was present. Frank provided detailed intelligence about the gambling operations to his former colleagues, including building layouts, security measures, and the identities of regular participants. He framed this as a civic duty from a retired detective who had maintained surveillance on criminal activity in his neighborhood during cancer recovery. The first raid netted 17 arrests, including David, who was caught with $8,000 in cash that he couldn't explain legally, money stolen from Frank's accounts just hours earlier. David was charged with illegal gambling, possession of stolen property, and conspiracy to operate an illegal gambling enterprise. Frank attended David's arraignment, sitting in the back of the courtroom as his nephew was processed through the same criminal justice system Frank had served for 3 decades. David looked confused and desperate, unable to understand how his carefully hidden gambling activities had suddenly been exposed to law enforcement. But Frank's revenge was just beginning. While David was dealing with criminal charges and trying to make bail with money he didn't have, Frank was building a comprehensive civil case that would destroy every aspect of David's life systematically and permanently. Frank had documented over $30,000 in theft, elder abuse violations, financial fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty that would result in both criminal penalties and civil liability. But more importantly, Frank had evidence of David's hope that his uncle would die from cancer, recorded conversations that would make David appear monstrous to any jury. Frank's plan was to let the criminal case proceed while simultaneously filing civil suits that would claim David's house, car, and future earnings. Frank wanted David to experience the same financial terror and uncertainty that he had inflicted on his uncle while Frank was fighting cancer. The most devastating part of Frank's revenge involved David's employer and professional reputation. Frank had copies of all the fake financial documents David had created, evidence of David's gambling addiction, and recordings of David discussing criminal activities from Frank's house phone. Frank sent anonymous packages containing this evidence to David's accounting firm, the state licensing board for certified public accountants and potential employers throughout the city. Frank ensured that David would never work in accounting again, destroying the career that David had built while stealing from his family. Frank's most brilliant move came when David was sitting in jail, desperate and confused about how his gambling activities had been exposed. Instead of letting his nephew rot in custody, Frank decided to orchestrate David's release so he could trap him in an even more devastating web of his own making. Frank contacted David's bail bondsman and anonymously paid the $10,000 bond, ensuring David would be released without knowing who had helped him. Frank wanted David back on the streets where he could make bigger mistakes under careful surveillance. When David walked out of jail, he was grateful but suspicious. He assumed one of his gambling associates had posted bail, but couldn't figure out why anyone would risk that much money for him. What David didn't know was that Frank had chosen the bail amount specifically because it would put David deeper in debt to people he thought were helping him. Frank's plan was psychologically brilliant. David now believed he owed $10,000 to dangerous criminals who had bailed him out of jail. Frank wanted David to feel that crushing pressure while being watched every moment, making decisions that would lead to even more serious criminal charges. David's first instinct after release was to run, leave town, change his name, disappear before the gambling debts and criminal charges destroyed his life completely. But Frank had anticipated this reaction and prepared the perfect trap to keep David in town, where Frank could control his destruction. Frank sent David an anonymous letter claiming to be from a wealthy business owner who knew about David's situation and wanted to offer him a way out. The letter suggested that David could earn $50,000 quickly by helping with some financial consulting that would solve all his problems at once. The letter directed David to a meeting at an upscale restaurant where Frank's police contacts had placed surveillance equipment. Frank wanted every conversation recorded as David agreed to participate in what he thought was a legitimate business opportunity, but was actually an elaborate sting operation designed to add federal charges to his growing legal problems. At the restaurant, David met with an undercover federal agent posing as a businessman who needed help laundering money through fake accounting records. David, desperate for quick money to pay his debts and legal fees, agreed to participate in what he believed was a victimless white-collar crime that would net him enough money to disappear permanently. Frank watched from across the restaurant as his nephew enthusiastically agreed to federal money laundering charges, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering violations that would add 20 years to any prison sentence he might receive from the gambling charges. But Frank's revenge required one more layer of betrayal that would destroy David's soul, the same way David's theft had broken Frank's heart. Frank arranged for David to discover that his generous benefactor, who had bailed him out of jail, was actually his dying uncle. The same man David had been stealing from while hoping he would die quickly. Frank left evidence for David to find: bank records showing the bail payment, surveillance photos of Frank at the bail bondsman's office, and a note explaining that Frank had discovered the theft months ago, but wanted David to destroy himself completely rather than simply turning him in to police. When David realized that his uncle had orchestrated his arrest, release, and deeper criminal involvement while David thought he was getting away with theft and betrayal, the psychological impact was devastating. David understood that every decision he had made since the first raid was actually controlled by Frank, leading him deeper into legal trouble while Frank documented every crime. Frank's final trap was the cruelest. He arranged for David to believe that Frank's cancer had taken a turn for the worse, and that Frank was dying in the hospital, alone, and asking for his nephew. Frank wanted David to come to the hospital believing he could manipulate a dying man one last time, possibly even steal Frank's final assets while Frank was unconscious and vulnerable. But when David arrived at the hospital, Frank was completely healthy, sitting up in bed with a room full of police officers, federal agents, and prosecutors who had been building cases against David for months with Frank's cooperation and evidence. David realized that his uncle's cancer recovery had been real, that Frank had been healthy enough to orchestrate David's destruction for months, while David believed he was stealing from a dying man who would never discover the theft. Frank looked at his nephew surrounded by law enforcement and spoke the words that would haunt David forever. "I taught you that family takes care of family. You taught me that trust is something criminals use as a weapon. Thank you for that lesson, David. I've been a much better detective since I learned not to trust anyone." The hospital room was silent except for the sound of David's ragged breathing as he realized the magnitude of his uncle's deception. Federal Agent Patricia Martinez stepped forward with handcuffs, but Frank held up his hand, signaling her to wait. He wanted this moment. 32 years of police work had taught him that the confession often mattered more than the arrest. "Sit down, David," Frank said calmly, gesturing to the chair beside his hospital bed. "We need to talk." David's legs felt weak as the reality of his situation crashed over him. The room contained Detective Lieutenant Sarah Walsh from Financial Crimes, FBI Agent Martinez, Assistant District Attorney Robert Chen, and his Uncle Frank, the man he thought was dying while he stole his life savings. "You've been healthy this whole time," David whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "The cancer treatment worked better than expected. I've been in remission for 4 months, Frank replied. "But I needed you to think I was still dying. Otherwise you might have stopped stealing, and I wouldn't have enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your life." David stared at his uncle. The man who had paid for his college education, celebrated his graduation, trusted him with power of attorney during what David believed was a terminal illness. Frank looked stronger than David had seen him in months, his eyes sharp and calculating like the detective David remembered from childhood stories. The gambling raids, the bail money, the business opportunity. David's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "All me," Frank confirmed. "I fed information to vice cops about the gambling locations you frequented. I paid your bail through a bondsman who works with the department. The business opportunity was Agent Martinez running a federal sting operation designed specifically for you." Agent Martinez spoke for the first time. "David Saunders, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, theft of over $30,000, and racketeering. We have recorded evidence of your participation in illegal gambling enterprises and your agreement to launder money through fake accounting records." David's world collapsed completely. "Uncle Frank, please, I was going to pay it back. I was sick. I needed help with my gambling problem. I never meant for it to go this far." Frank's expression didn't soften. You recorded conversations show you discussing how long my cancer would take to kill me. You calculated my life expectancy like a business asset. You hoped I would die before discovering your theft." The prosecutor, Robert Chen, opened a file and began reading charges that would put David away for decades. Federal money laundering carried a 20-year sentence. Elder abuse was a felony with mandatory minimums. The theft charges alone were worth 5 to 10 years, and the conspiracy charges could add another decade. "Your nephew made one critical mistake," Chen explained to Frank. "He agreed to launder money for what he thought was a legitimate criminal organization. That transforms simple theft into organized crime activity with federal jurisdiction and much harsher penalties." David began crying. Not the tears of remorse, but the desperate sobbing of someone who finally understood that his life was over. "I can't go to prison for 20 years. I'll be 50 when I get out. My life will be ruined." "Your life?" Frank's voice turned cold. "You stole my retirement money while I was fighting cancer. You hoped I would die so you could keep stealing. You betrayed 15 years of trust and love because you were too weak to admit you had a gambling problem." Detective Walsh added her own perspective. "We've been investigating illegal gambling in this city for years without success. Your uncle provided intelligence that led to 17 arrests and the shutdown of 4 major operations. He's done more for this investigation as a victim than most informants do in exchange for immunity deals." Frank stood up from his hospital bed, revealing that he was wearing street clothes, not a hospital gown. The entire medical setting had been staged to lure David into one final confession, surrounded by law enforcement witnesses. "David, you taught me something valuable about family loyalty," Frank said. "You taught me that it's not automatic. It has to be earned and maintained through trust and respect. You lost both when you decided my life was worth less than your gambling debts." Agent Martinez stepped forward again with the handcuffs. "David Saunders, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As David was being read his rights, Frank delivered his final blow. "Your apartment has been searched under warrant. Your car has been seized as proceeds from criminal activity. Your bank accounts are frozen pending restitution hearings. Your accounting license has been suspended by the state board." David looked up from the handcuffs with complete desperation. "What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live?" Frank's answer was delivered with the same calm professionalism he had used to close hundreds of cases during his career. "You're going to learn what it feels like to lose everything you thought was secure. You're going to understand what it means to have your future stolen by someone you trusted. And you're going to serve every day of your sentence knowing that the man you tried to destroy is the reason you got caught." As David was led out of the room in handcuffs, Frank called out one last time. "David, that $50,000 you thought you could steal from my emergency fund? I donated it to the police department's victim assistance program this morning. Your theft is going to help other families recover from crimes exactly like yours." The door closed behind David, and Frank was alone with the law enforcement team that had helped him orchestrate the most personal case of his career. Detective Walsh shook his hand with genuine admiration. "Frank, in 30 years of police work, I've never seen a victim build a case this thorough against a family member. The evidence you gathered is so comprehensive that David's lawyer will probably recommend he plead guilty to avoid an even harsher sentence at trial." Frank nodded, feeling both satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it had cost him the only family relationship he had left after his wife's death. The nephew he had loved like a son was going to prison for decades, destroyed by his own greed and Frank's methodical pursuit of accountability. 6 months later, David was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to avoid a trial that could have resulted in a life sentence. The judge called it one of the most callous cases of elder abuse she had seen, noting that David had betrayed family trust while his victim was fighting a life-threatening illness. Frank attended every court hearing, watching his nephew's transformation from a confident accountant to a broken man who understood that his gambling addiction had cost him everything. David's lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on addiction and family trauma, but Frank's recorded evidence made mercy impossible. The recordings of David discussing Frank's life expectancy like a business timeline were played in court, causing audible gasps from spectators. David's own words condemned him more effectively than any prosecutor's argument, showing a level of cold calculation that shocked even experienced court officials. Frank recovered his stolen money through restitution orders and civil judgments, but the financial compensation couldn't repair the emotional damage of discovering that his closest family member had hoped for his death. Frank returned to his quiet retirement, his cancer in full remission, but now completely alone in the world. The police department honored Frank with a Civilian Service Award for his investigation work, noting that his intelligence gathering had shut down gambling operations that had operated freely for over a decade. Frank's methodical evidence collection became a training case for financial crimes detectives, learning how to investigate complex family fraud. But Frank's victory came with an unexpected cost. The stress of orchestrating David's destruction, combined with the betrayal trauma, had changed Frank in ways that worried his former colleagues. He had become colder, more suspicious, and completely unwilling to trust anyone with any aspect of his personal life. Frank's neighbors noticed that he had installed extensive security systems, changed his locks multiple times, and stopped accepting help from anyone for any reason. The warm, family-oriented man who had once loved having David visit every Sunday had been replaced by someone who viewed every relationship as a potential threat to his security. 6 months after David's sentencing, Frank received an unexpected visitor at his front door. A young woman in her 20s, well-dressed and professional, introduced herself as Jennifer Saunders, David's younger sister who had been estranged from the family for over a decade. Frank had forgotten that David even had a sister. She had moved across the country after a family argument and had never maintained contact with David or attended family gatherings. Frank barely remembered her from David's college graduation, where she had seemed uncomfortable and left early without explanation. Jennifer explained that she had learned about David's arrest and conviction through news coverage of the elder abuse case. She had driven across 3 states to meet Frank and discuss something important about David's criminal activities that the police investigation had missed. "Mr. Morrison," Jennifer said carefully, "there are things about David's gambling problem that you don't know. Things that started long before he stole from you. I need to tell you about what David did to our grandmother before she died." Frank's blood ran cold as Jennifer continued. "David didn't just steal from you. He's been targeting elderly family members for years. Our grandmother died believing she was broke because David had been stealing her Social Security checks and selling her medications. She died alone and terrified because David convinced her that her children had abandoned her." Jennifer pulled out a folder of documents, bank records, forged checks, and evidence that David had been running elder abuse schemes against multiple family members for over a decade. Frank realized that his investigation had only uncovered David's most recent crimes, not the full pattern of family predation that stretched back years. "There's something else," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "David isn't the only one. There are others in our family who have been doing this to elderly relatives. David learned these techniques from our cousin Michael, who's been stealing from nursing home patients for 15 years. Frank stared at the evidence Jennifer had brought, realizing that David's crimes were part of a much larger family conspiracy, targeting vulnerable elderly people throughout the region. Frank's careful investigation had only scratched the surface of a criminal network that had been operating with impunity for over a decade. Jennifer's final revelation made Frank's hands shake with rage. "David called me from prison last week. He's not sorry about what he did to you, Mr. Morrison. He's angry that you outsmarted him, and he's been talking to other inmates about ways to get revenge on family members who turn relatives into police. Jennifer looked directly into Frank's eyes with genuine fear. David knows you're alone now, Mr. Morrison. He knows you have money and property, and he's been giving other criminals information about your security systems and daily routines. He's not done with you. As Jennifer prepared to leave, she handed Frank one final document, a prison visitor log, showing that David had been receiving visits from people Frank didn't recognize, including several individuals with criminal records for elder abuse, financial fraud, and violent crimes against senior citizens. David's 18-year sentence might not be the end of this, Jennifer warned. It might just be the beginning of something much worse. The door closed behind Jennifer, and Frank was left alone with the terrifying realization that his perfect revenge had created a new enemy who had 18 years in prison to plan retaliation, access to career criminals who specialized in targeting the elderly, and nothing left to lose. Frank Morrison thought he had won, but David's real revenge was about to begin.